Okay, it is 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Let me get my right screen up here. Okay, thank you all for joining us, and I appreciate you guys leaving the comments in the chat box to let us know where you're from. I'm Candace Shively with Utah State University Extension, and these monthly webinars are supported by USU Center for Water Efficient Landscaping. And for those of you that have been joining us over the last year, I hope you've been finding them beneficial. And for any newcomers, welcome, and we hope to see you next month. Today we have Brent Black joining us. He's also with Utah State University. He is our Extension Fruit Specialist, and today he'll be covering orchard irrigation principles and letting you guys know about some cool resources that are available to you. There is going to be a question and answer session, so if you have questions as we're going along, please use the question and answer box versus the text box. It just helps me keep track of what we've answered a little bit easier than the chat box does. So with that, I will turn it over to Brent. Ooh.
You got them, Candace?
You are unmuted and good to go.
Okay, my name is Brent Black. I'm Extension Fruit Specialist, and I have done some work on orchard irrigation, and so I appreciate Candace inviting me to visit with you all. I'm going to talk about just general principles of orchard irrigation, kind of an intro, and cover some of the real basics and kind of the things that are specific to orchards to consider. So kind of an overview what I want to talk about. The role of water in fruit crops and fruit trees as well as berries. A lot of this applies to berries as well. Some of the water-related disorders, either over or under irrigation disorders that we see in fruit crops that might be unique, that you can kind of pay attention to and look for the symptoms. How we look at the level of or amount of water in the soil. Root distribution as it relates to fruit trees, so that you know kind of the volume of soil that you're dealing with in terms of your water management. And then some things about the use rates of water for different fruit crops. And then finally, just irrigation scheduling. So going back to your high school biology, I know this is going to be very basic, but I want to kind of just review what is the role of water in fruit trees and berry crops, because that is related to the kinds of disorders and situations that we see when we don't manage our water appropriately. So here's the basic use of water by the plant. The primary use, most of the water that's taken up by the plant is used for what's called gas exchange, which means the stomates on the leaf open, water vapor goes out, oxygen goes out, and CO2 is taken in. And without that stomate open, then the CO2 can't get in and you can't get photosynthesis going. But in addition to just exchanging water for CO2, that's an important process in terms of cooling the leaf down. Typically with a well-watered plant, the leaf temperature can be several degrees colder than the air temperature. And then when the plant gets under stress and those stomates close, those leaf temperatures can climb to be several degrees warmer than air temperature. And so it's important for cooling. But that's really where most of the water goes that's taken up by the plant. The other thing that's important to understand is what's called turgor pressure. So as there's available water in the plant, it's taken up by the cell and it creates internal pressure within the cell. So if you look here on the right, this hypotonic situation is where the cell is pulling water in and it's trying to swell there. And one of the ways that the plant regulates growth is by regulating the amount of water that gets pulled into the cell. And then there's a process called cell wall loosening, which is where these cell walls will stretch, and that allows for those cells to expand. And that's really critical. If you've got a lack of water, then you get a flaccid cell, or you can get a plasmolyzed cell where there's no internal pressure, and that's usually what results in wilting. But it's also key for cell growth. So if we have drought stress, the first thing that happens is we reduce photosynthesis. If those stomates are closed, we don't get CO2 in. We can't fix that CO2 into sugars that the plant can use to grow. So you get reduced plant growth. The second is reduced cell growth, and the cells can be in the shoot so that you get reduced shoot growth, but it also affects fruit size and fruit shape. In the development of fruit, on here we have pictures of apples, but apples or cherries or peaches or any of the fruit crops of interest, the cell division that happens in that fruit is usually very early in the season. And then as the season progresses, it shifts from cell division, or the increase of cell number, to cell enlargement. And so the primary driver of that late stage fruit growth is the uptake of water and the expansion of those cells, and also the space in between the cells. And that's what gives you fruit size and the appropriate shape. And so when you have drought stress during that, particularly that later stage of fruit development, the primary result is that you get smaller fruit than you would have been able to get otherwise. Another situation that's also irrigation related is localized calcium deficiencies. And there's two examples here on the right. The bottom is what's called blossom end rot in tomato. The top is called bitter pit. And what happens there is the calcium that is needed in the fruit is taken up in the transpiration stream and moves up through the plant with the water as it's moving towards the leaves and the fruit. And if you have irregular irrigation or periods of short drought stress and uneven availability of water, you can cause this localized calcium deficiency in the fruit that results in these kinds of disorders like is shown here. And so consistent irrigation is important. That's not the only cause that brings those about, but it's oftentimes exacerbated if you aren't irrigating regularly. Also related to this is you may have situations where you've got calcium deficiency or other things that may not show these external symptoms, but they may be bad enough that if you're going to put these apples in storage for a period of time, you'll see storage disorders that develop as a result of these localized nutrient deficiencies resulting from irrigation problems. Another one we see a lot of in Utah is sunburn. And this is an example from raspberries. You can see here these white or bleached drupelets on one side of the fruit. Oftentimes they're on the upper side of the fruit where it's sun exposed. And that's a heat stress situation, and it's made much worse when you have drought stress as that fruit is ripening. You'll see these bleached drupelets. So that's, we also get sunburning in other fruit, but this is a real prime example that we see a lot of in Utah. So another one that people don't typically think about is flower bud initiation. And fruit trees initiate the flower buds the season before they actually open. In fact, for example, the case of cherries, the flower buds start to form about 4 or 5 weeks after bloom. So this spring, your trees will flower, and then within a month, you start to get development of the flower buds for the next year. And if you have drought stress during this period of flower bud initiation, then you can get malformed flowers. And what that looks, first of all, it affects return bloom, but the other thing you see a lot of is this doubling or twinning. So here on the top, I've heard people call these Siamese twin apples for obvious reasons. You'll get this doubling. These are immature sweet cherries. You get it in peaches. And if you don't get a full doubling, like is shown down here, you'll get what they call a deep suture, like this, where it's almost 2 peaches, but not quite. It's kind of divided. And all of these disorders result from drought stress as the flower bud is initiating. So we've seen this in situations where if we have some problems with the irrigation, or we have particularly hot temperatures and the trees are just having a difficult time taking up enough water to cool themselves down during that period of time, then that's what you see the following year. So those are some other ones. Split pit in peaches is a common thing, and it can be caused by several different things. It's more prone in certain varieties or cultivars than others. It can be caused by the timing of your fertilizer application, but one of the real common causes in cultivars that are prone to this is kind of irregular water availability. And usually what happens is you get lower trigger pressure because there's not as much water available in that fruit. And then when you irrigate, and all of a sudden there's this rapid increase in trigger pressure as those cells take up all that water, it essentially causes the pit to split open. And so here's fruit that's intact, but you'll see it's kind of hollow in the middle. This is on the stem end. And when you split it open, here's half of the pit over here, and here's the rest of the pit with the seed on the other side. And it's just split open, and then what happens is the tissue around that pit starts to degrade and ripen too quickly as a response to that wounding. So that's another drought-related or uneven irrigation supply type of a disorder that we see. Another one that we see is from over-irrigation is what's called crown and collar rot. This is in fruit trees that's fairly common. You'll see these trees here in the picture, they show the symptoms down here with the damaged tissue around the graft union and just above and below. This tree hasn't died yet, but once that damaged tissue works its way around, it'll girdle and kill the tree. And if you cut that open, it'll have reddish brown tissue underneath that callus there, underneath that wound. This again, it's typically caused by overwatering or poor drainage in your soil. It's caused by Phytophthora, which is a root rotting organism, and Phytophthora shows different symptoms in different crops. So in fruit trees, you'll get this crown and collar rot. In raspberries, it just looks like the roots just die and the plants start to wilt and die. And then when you dig it up, you see this characteristic red tissue in the roots. In strawberries, it's called red steel disease, and it's basically very similar type of a thing. So overwatering, you're going to get problems with that. Another problem with overwatering is nutrient leaching. So you're putting fertilizer on, you're running too much water, and then it just leaches the nutrients, your fertilizer, away from the roots of the plant and down through the soil profile where the tree can't take it up anymore. So you're basically wasting your fertilizer bill. And then just general plant stress. If the soil's waterlogged, you'll get reduced root growth, you'll get overall plant stress. So those are kind of the two extremes in terms of some of the disorders that you might see and how they manifest themselves in fruit crops. Next, I want to talk about soil water content, and this is kind of a diagram of from the top, saturated soil that's completely saturated with water down to completely bone dry soil. And you can see I've kind of got it color coded. Somewhere below saturated is a point called field capacity, and that's where the readily available or the water that's in excess of what can be held in the soil drains away. So typically, if you do a heavy irrigation, you reach field capacity about 24 hours later as that excess water drains away. That is if you have well-drained soil. But really only about half of that water below field capacity is available to the plant. The other half is considered unavailable, and it's being held so tightly by the soil that the plant really can't get a hold of it. So really what we're talking about, and when it gets to that point, it's called permanent wilting point. The plant can't get the water out of the soil, it wilts and it dies. So really what you're managing is this available water. That's about half of the water between field capacity and completely bone dry. However, just because it's available doesn't mean it's really readily available. And really when you've depleted about half of the available water, you start to see plant stress. So if you want to keep the plant growing healthy and as vigorous as possible, you want to really keep the water level here above this line of allowable depletion or managed allowable depletion. So you want to keep the water level in the soil in this range right here between field capacity and this beginning of plant stress. So what that might look like if you were irrigating over time, let's just take that same graph and say over time, if we looked at our water level, it might drop down as it's being drawn up by the plant, then you irrigate, brings it up maybe above field capacity briefly, and then it's drawn down and you want to irrigate before it hits that refill line so that you're keeping the plant at optimum growth. So that would be typical of, a long irrigation cycle. However, because of some of the disorders that we talked about, like bitter pit, like split pits and peaches, it actually is better if we can keep it at a little bit narrower range and maybe irrigate more frequently, not over irrigate and cause the soil to be saturated, but just kind of keep it in a narrower band within that range of soil moisture. So that's really more ideal, particularly when we think about pit splitting, doubling, calcium uptake, all these potential disorders that we might run into. A more consistent soil moisture level tends to work better for that. So how much water is in the soil? I mean, if we go back to this graph, what does that mean? How much water is in that range? And that depends on the soil type and particularly the soil texture. So this is a table shows kind of water holding capacity of different soil textures. And this is available in our fact sheet on orchard irrigation, which I'm going to talk about just a little bit later. So if you look here, different soils, the first column here is the amount of water that's held within a foot of soil, and this is in inches. So say, for example, loam soil holds roughly 2 inches of water per foot of soil. And typically, and I know there's people joining from outside of Utah and all over, but for Utah soils, orchard tree roots typically are in about the top 2.5 to 3 feet of soil for a mature orchard, and for younger, obviously not so much. So this is this first column is the total available water, and then this is readily available water. This is that water that's available before we run into drought stress in a 2-foot depth versus a 3-foot rooting depth. So so for the example, if total available water is 2 inches per foot, then readily available water in 2 feet is 2 inches, and for 3 feet it's 3 inches. It makes the math pretty simple, but that's how that's read. And you can see for sandy and fine sandy soils, the water holding capacity is going to be a lot less in a foot of soil than for some of these heavier loamy soils that can hold on to their water a little bit better. How do we measure how much water is in the soil? There's different methods. This is a little guide that I found online where you can pull up a handful of soil and squeeze it, and based on whether or not you can squeeze moisture and how well that ball of soil holds together as an indication of how much available water there is. And again, this is going to depend somewhat on your soil type. So this, I only showed this one example for sandy, clay, loam, or loam, but if you went to different soil textures, these pictures would look a little bit differently. So that's one way that you can just by feel determine how much water is in your soil. And it's oftentimes used very, very successfully. Another way, if we want to measure more precisely, is to put some type of soil moisture sensor in the soil. And these are 2 examples that we've used in orchards. The one on the left, this is called a fluid-filled tensiometer. What this is a tube with a pressure gauge, and then on the bottom is a porous kind of a ceramic tip. What you do is you fill this full of water, get all the bubbles out, close the lid, push this down into the soil at the depth that you want to read, and then it comes into equilibrium. As the soil dries out, it pulls water out of this tube and it creates a vacuum, and this gauge tells you the vacuum in terms of how hard the soil is pulling to get the water out of the tube, and that is analogous to how hard the plant has to pull to get water out of the soil. Another approach that we've used is these resistance blocks. This particular one is it's got like a fiberglass filling in there, and then there's 2 electrodes that are led up to the top with these wires. Bury this in the soil, and then the amount of water in there influences the electrical conductivity through that. And this is just a conductivity meter that's used to read how much water is in the soil. And we've used these, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. So these are 2 different methods that I can use to get a number for what my soil moisture level is that's maybe more precise than squeezing a handful of soil. The challenge too is to know what my rooting depths are. This is a map. We did a distribution of peach roots in a very young orchard. Most of the roots at this site were between about 4 inches and 24 inches, with the highest concentration about 1 foot deep. And this is looking a cross section of the soil from where the tree is located to farther away. So you can see in that particular setting, our soils were mostly in the top 2 feet. And again, rooting depth is affected by the soil type. It's also affected by climate. So in Utah, where we have a colder climate, our soils don't warm up as much in the summer. That's really where most of our roots are. I know in, say, California and warmer climates, they'll get much deeper rooting in their fruit trees. But you really want to be able to monitor the soil moisture in that range. What I typically recommend, if you're going to use a tensiometer or you're going to use a resistance block, is you put several in the ground, one maybe 6 to 8 inches deep, so you're down kind of below. If you've got grass or annual weeds, you're kind of below where they're drawing water, and then down at about 2 feet where you've got where your root density starts to drop off. So just monitoring that range in both of those depths is a good way to see where you need to be. So another thing I'll just show, this is a picture of a tart cherry orchard. These tubes that are sticking out of the ground, they have electrodes, and we have these running to a computer. Each one of these at the bottom of that tube is one of those resistance block sensors. And the reason they're color coded is because the tubes are different lengths. And so I have these sensors at different depths, and I know which one's which based on the color, so that I can monitor the soil moisture in this tree row. The other thing that I want to point out here is that this is in this commercial orchard, they try and keep this area under the tree as a weed, they call it a weed-free strip. There's weeds there, I know, but they'll either use herbicides or mulches to try and keep the vegetation to a minimum. And usually they want to keep about 3 feet radius. So this is 3 feet from here to the grass and 3 feet from here to the grass. So a 3 foot radius around this, and this is a mature tart cherry tree, where they keep it weed free. And the primary reasons are, number one, so that the grass isn't competing for the fertilizers. So they'll put their fertilizer in this strip. And then the other is so that the grass isn't so much directly competing for the available water. And we've done some studies where we've excavated and looked at where the roots are distributed in an orchard. And interestingly enough, even for these large trees, most of the roots are within that strip. There's not a lot of roots that go out underneath the grass. Even though there's ample water out there, the grass is competing, and most of the roots are staying in that area. So this is an important thing to think about if you have a small backyard orchard or a home garden situation. If you've got the grass right up against the tree, it's competing for nutrients and for water, and making it hard to get a consistent soil moisture for that fruit tree to really be able to thrive. So yeah, about 3 foot radius, and that's how we do that. So this is I'm just going to show a little bit example. This is a peach orchard up along the Fruitway in Box Elder County, where we installed some of these sensors and hooked them up to a little computer that's shown here that logs the soil moisture at 6 and 18 inches and 2.5 feet depth. We did this over the course of a season, and this particular grower uses furrow irrigation, and so he doesn't have to irrigate very frequently, which is not the best for a peach situation because you get split pits and the other disorders we talked about. But you'll notice, so that this is read from 0 to 240 is what this sensor will actually read, and 240 is as dry as it'll possibly read. 0 means it's essentially saturated. So over the course of the season, you can see they irrigated, or they let it dry down. The surface 6 inches got almost bone dry, just dust dry. The magenta here is at 18 inches and the green is at 30 inches. When he irrigated and essentially flooded that field, everything jumped clear up to saturation almost immediately. And over the course of the next few weeks, again, this shallow soil the shallow depths draw way down to really dry. And yet, if you look down at 18 inches, we're still at about 50 centibars, which is okay. I mean, that's about the point you want to irrigate. So this illustrates a couple of things. Number one, just because the surface of the soil is dry doesn't mean that it's time to irrigate for fruit trees. If I'm going to, and tracking the greater depths is really what I want to do. And in this case where he's flooding it every time, it's bringing it back up to saturation each time. So it's important to monitor the soil moisture down at that depth. And that's one of the other challenges with going out and squeezing a handful of soil, because you'd need to get soil up from 1.5 feet deep and squeeze that to really know if it's time to irrigate or not. And just the surface soil is maybe not the best indicator. So that kind of shows you what some things to think about. The other thing that I want to talk about, or the next topic I want to talk about, is estimating water use rates. And this is what's called the Penman-Monteith equation. It's more complex than this, but the way it works is if you want to know what the ET stands for, evapotranspiration. So that's the water that's being used by the crop as well as the water that's evaporating from the soil surface. So everything that's going out into the atmosphere is the ET, or the evapotranspiration of your crop. The way that this is calculated is by coming up with a reference ET, which is a comparison to, say, a known crop where we know how much the water is used, and then an adjustment or a fudge factor, which is called the crop coefficient, which is how does my crop relate to this reference. So the reference ET is based on, usually it's either alfalfa or grass, and it's calculated using measurements of air temperature, humidity, wind speed, these kinds of things. And so it's been worked out, this Penman-Monteith uses those parameters to calculate, okay, this is how much water a full stand of alfalfa would use under these conditions. And we use weather stations to calculate this that have temperature sensors, humidity sensors, wind indicators that can collect the data and calculate a reference ET, or evapotranspiration. So then we need to know what the water requirement of your specific crop relative to that reference. So where do we get this information? Where do I find reference ET? One of the places that works really well for us is the Utah Climate Center website. If you go to climate.usu.edu, this is what their website looks like. You can look under different spots here under plant management. I don't have this live, but under plant management, there's a thing there that says orchard weather, and then under Utah Ag Weather, there's a broader range of weather stations scattered around Utah. And then the other place you can look is this Utah Climate Database server, and this accesses weather stations not just in Utah but all over North America. They're in Canada and all over the US, and you can zoom in on that map and find a weather station that's close to you that might be similar to your conditions, and then access that information. So this is just looking under this Utah Ag Weather. The next page down shows a map, and these are all of the various weather stations that are in Utah. And you can zoom in and click on each one of those and download data. And this is kind of example of the type of data that you can access here. So I just pulled up a week or 10 days from last June, and it shows the minimum temperature in Fahrenheit, the maximum temperature, and then this is the reference ET in inches of water per day. So this is saying if there was a full stand of alfalfa out there on this day with these conditions, and it also shows wind speed, but I'm not showing that. It's calculated based on temperature, wind speed, humidity, and it says based on those conditions, the reference ET was 0.27 inches per day. And you can see as we have hot days, that jumps clear up to 0.3 of an inch, and here's even 0.4 of an inch, maybe not as hot, but I'm guessing that the humidity was lower and there was some wind to pull the moisture out. And so this shows you the daily reference ET, and then this is kind of a running total of what the weekly ET would be in inches. So you can see early on when it was cooler, it was 1.6 inches. We get up to 2 or 2.1 inches per week of reference ET. So that's one important component we need to know. The second is this, so that gives us a reference ET. The second is this crop coefficient. And this is what the crop coefficients look like for apples over the course of a season. And so each of these points, this 0 point on the season is when the apples are in full bloom. And then full canopy is at 100. And then harvest is out here about 160, 170. And then this is post-harvest into the fall. And so you can see at bloom time, the apple crop coefficient is 0.2. What that means is that an apple tree, when it's in bloom, is using about 20% as much water as the equivalent area of alfalfa if you had a full alfalfa stand. And then as it leaves out, it increases until you get up to here about, say, 95% of, or 0.95 or 95% of what alfalfa would use. By the time you get out to harvest, an apple tree is using the same amount of water per acre. Apple orchard is using the same amount as an acre of alfalfa. And then once harvest occurs, it drops off. So where do I get this information, or where do you find that? We have fact sheets on our website. If you go to fruit.usu.edu, we have individual fact sheets for apple, peach, cherry, cane fruits, which is raspberry and blackberry, as well as strawberry. And there's these crop coefficients over the course of the season are available for each of these crops. Most of these we get from, there's a Agromat is the group that's in Washington that calculates these for a lot of the fruit crops. And if you go to their website, you can find these crop coefficients as well. So that's the other piece of the puzzle that we need to know and estimate how much our situation we're needing in terms of water. So I'm just going to run through kind of an example. So we'll just make a scenario, an established apple planting. This is now early June. We have a sandy loam soil. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to go to one of these weather stations, look at what our ET is for the past week or 8 days or whatever. We'll see that maybe we're running at about 2.1 or we'll say 2.1 inches per week. Okay, so that's one component. We know our reference ET is 2.1. Okay. The next thing we'll do is we'll look at these crop coefficient curves for this season and say, well, we've got pretty much full canopy closure, still got green fruit there. So we'll say, okay, it's about 0.95 is my crop coefficient. So if we use those two numbers, 2.1 inches is my reference ET, 0.95 gets us to about 2 inches of water per week that this orchard is using. The next question is, how does that translate into when I need to irrigate? Okay, if I go back and say a sandy loam soil is right here, it's 1.2 to 1.5 inches of available water, but I don't want available, I want readily available, which means in 2 feet, I might have 1.2 to 1.5 inches of water available. And in 3 feet, I'm going to say it's a well-rooted mature orchard, it's probably around this. I can calculate what my water holding capacity is in the top 3 feet. So what that means, if it's using 2 inches of water per week, I've got to irrigate before I hit that 2-inch mark. And so I've got to probably be watering at least every 6 days to supply the water. Now, again, if I have a sandy soil and I can only hold less than an inch, then I'm going to probably be needing to water about every 3 days, and a good deep watering every 3 days to supply the water that tree needs. So that's kind of an example of how I might come up with those calculations. Now that I've given you the hard answer, let me give you the easy answer. There's a new mobile app that's available for your phone. This was developed by Washington State University. It's called the Irrigation Scheduler. If you go on your Play Store or your Apple Store or whatever, they've got this available. You can download it for free onto your phone. If you don't have a smartphone, you can actually download it to your computer, and it's freely available. then what you do is you put in here, you don't put your name, you put in the name of the field. So if I have a Fuji apple block that I want to monitor, I'll put Fuji apple in here, or Uncle Bob's Fuji apples or whatever. And then I'm going to select the network of weather stations that I want to access, and I'll select the closest weather station to my situation. And the exciting news for me here is that Utah was just added to this network. So up until last fall, we couldn't access Utah weather stations on this app, but now those have been added. So if you're in Utah, Idaho, I believe Oregon, Washington, I don't know who all else is included. It's getting to be quite an extensive set of networks. You can come in here and select a weather station close to you, select the crop that you're growing, whether it's apple or peach or cherry, and then it will access the weather station. It'll access the crop coefficient for that crop and be able to use that to come up with a projection in terms of how much water your specific site is using. Then you also enter your soil type so that it knows roughly what your water holding capacity your soil is. And then it will tell you, once you have all that information entered in, it will access those weather stations, and it will estimate what your recent evapotranspiration would have been if your orchard was well watered, which is what I just showed you how to do by hand. But the really interesting thing about this app is it will look at the weather forecast for the next several days and predict or project what the ET would be for the next 3 days based on if the tree was well watered. I think this is a really neat tool and something that I'm looking forward to being able to help our growers get accustomed to and be able to use this to do a better job of maintaining appropriate water levels for good crop growth. So just kind of in summary, and this is just closing down what I've covered and reviewing. Really, tree health and fruit quality depends on carefully maintaining your soil moisture in that optimum range. The water holding capacity depends on soil texture. Monitor your soil, and again, for Utah, I recommend between at 8 and 24 inches. If you're in a situation where your rooting depth might be shallower in a colder climate, or maybe deeper in a warmer climate, you may want to look at that. Under tree competition limits root distribution. It limits it. It competes for water. So I really recommend having a vegetation-free area under the tree, whether it's maintained by herbicides or by mulch. I didn't talk about this, but some people will do cultivation there. I don't really recommend that because you get a lot of tree roots even up at 3-4 inches deep. So if you do very much cultivation, you're disrupting tree roots. So if you're going to do cultivation, just do very shallow. And then your water use varies with weather conditions, stage of crop development, and you can access weather conditions through one of these orchard weather networks or close nearby weather station and know what your crop coefficient is. And if you have access to it, this irrigation scheduler is a great way to do both of these. And that's all I have, Candace.
That's awesome. This will be recorded. I'll email it out to you guys once I figure out how to get it edited and posted online, so bear with me. But thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Brent, for your time. That was really informative and beneficial.
Thank you.